The diner sat at the edge of a forgotten highway, its neon sign flickering like a heartbeat against the November dusk. Inside, 7-year-old Marlo Thorne pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching as 18 motorcycles rumbled into the gravel lot, chrome gleaming, engines roaring like thunder that shook the salt shakers on every table. Her foster mother, Celeste, gripped her wrist. "Don't stare at them," she whispered. But Marlo couldn't look away. These weren't the monsters the town whispered about. These were the men who'd pulled her from a burning car 3 months ago, when the driver, a stranger with empty eyes, had swerved off Route 9 and crashed into the ravine. She remembered leather-gloved hands breaking the window, a voice saying, "I got you. Good kid, you're safe now." The leader dismounted first, a man the size of a grizzly, his vest bearing the name Flint in faded letters. Marlo slipped from her foster mother's grip and ran straight to him, her small hand tugging his jacket. "You came," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I knew you would." Flint crouched down, his weathered face softening. "Told you we'd check on you, didn't I?" What happened next would challenge everything the town of Ridgemont believed about judgment, redemption, and the families we choose when the ones we're born into fail us. Because Marlo didn't just want to thank them, she wanted them at her school play, front row, leather vests and all. And what those bikers did on that small elementary school stage would ripple through that community, like a stone through still water, revealing that sometimes the most broken-looking people carry the most unbreakable promises. This is the story of how one little girl's invitation became a town's reckoning, and how 18 motorcycle riders proved that honor doesn't need a badge. It just needs a promise kept. The crash happened on September 14th, just as the autumn sun bled orange across Route 9. If you're hearing this story for the first time, welcome. Stay until the end. You'll understand why this moment changed everything. Marlo Thorne, 7 years old with a constellation of freckles across her nose, sat in the back seat of a sedan, driven by a man she'd never met before. The social worker had called him a temporary transport. Someone to take her from the hospital to her new foster home 40 miles north. The man smelled like cigarettes and something bitter Marlo couldn't name. He drove too fast, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "You got people waiting for you?" he asked, his voice scratchy. Marlo shook her head. She had no people. Her mother had disappeared 6 months ago, leaving nothing but unpaid bills and a note that said, "I'm sorry." Her father was a name on a birth certificate, nothing more. The state had shuffled her through 3 homes in 4 months, each one a temporary placeholder, each goodbye a little piece of her that stopped expecting permanence. The sedan swerved suddenly, tires screaming against asphalt. Marlo's seatbelt cut into her chest as the car fishtailed, then plunged off the road into the ravine. Metal crumpled, glass exploded. The world became a kaleidoscope of pain and smoke, and the acrid smell of something burning. She couldn't feel her legs, couldn't breathe. The driver was slumped forward, motionless, blood trickling from his temple. Marlo tried to scream, but her voice had abandoned her, leaving only silence and the crackling sound of flames beginning to lick the front hood. Then she heard them. The rumble started distant, like approaching thunder, then grew until it shook the earth itself. Through the shattered window, Marlo saw motorcycles, 18 of them, pulling to a stop above the ravine. Men dismounted, moving with the efficiency of soldiers, their leather vests bearing the rocker patch that made mothers pull their children closer in grocery store aisles. Hell's Angels. The first one down the slope was a mountain of a man, his beard streaked with grey, his arms covered in tattoos that told stories Marlo was too young to read. He reached the car in seconds, his massive hands gripping the doorframe. "Kid, can you hear me?" His voice was rough, but steady, the kind of voice that didn't panic. Marlo nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Name's Flint," You're gonna be fine. Just stay still. He turned to someone behind him. Greer, get the pry bar. Vesper, call it in. This car's gonna blow. Another biker appeared, leaner, younger, with eyes the color of steel. He wedged a pry bar into the doorframe while Flint braced himself against the car. Metal shrieked as the door gave way. Flint reached inside, his hands impossibly gentle as they unclipped Marlowe's seatbelt. You trust me? He asked. Marlowe didn't know why, but she nodded. Then hold on tight. He lifted her from the wreckage just as flames engulfed the front seats. The explosion came 30 seconds later, a roar that sent shockwaves through the ravine. But by then, Marlowe was 20 feet away. Wrapped in a leather jacket that smelled like motor oil and safety, Flint's heartbeat steady beneath her ear. The ambulance arrived 12 minutes later. Paramedics rushed forward, but Flint didn't let go until Marlowe's fingers loosened from his jacket. You saved me, she whispered. Flint crouched down, his eyes level with hers. And I'll check on you. That's a promise. 3 months passed. Marlowe healed, physically at least. The bruises faded, the cuts became thin white lines, but the nightmares remained, and with them the memory of leather-gloved hands and a promise spoken in the shadow of flames. Now, on a grey November afternoon, she stood in that highway diner, watching those same motorcycles pull into the parking lot. Her foster mother, Celeste, a kind woman with tired eyes who ran a small farm outside Ridgemont, gripped her shoulder. Marlowe, those men... But Marlowe was already moving, her small legs carrying her through the diner's door and into the cold air. Flint dismounted, his expression shifting from neutral to surprised as the little girl ran straight to him. You came, Marlowe said, her voice breaking with relief. You remembered. Flint's weathered face softened. He knelt down, bringing himself to her height. Told you I'd check on you, didn't I? A promise is a promise. Behind him, the other bikers stood watching. Greer with his scarred hands, Vesper with his perpetual scowl, and 15 others, whose names Marlowe didn't know, but whose presence made her feel safer than any locked door ever had. I need to ask you something, Marlowe said, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her pocket. It was a flyer printed in cheerful purple letters. Ridgemont Elementary. Presents, a winter's promise. Friday, December 3rd, 7:00 p.m. I'm in the school play, she said, her voice small but determined. And I want you to come, all of you. Front row. Flint took the flyer. Studying it with the same seriousness he might give a military order. Around him, the other bikers exchanged glances. Ridgemont wasn't their territory. It was a small town with big opinions. The kind of place where motorcycle clubs were synonymous with trouble, where leather vests triggered locked doors and sideways stares. Kid, Flint said carefully, you sure about this? Your school might not... I don't care, Marlowe interrupted, her small hands gripping his jacket. You were there when no one else was. You saved me, and I want you there for this too. Something shifted in Flint's expression. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of the man beneath the patches and the reputation. He looked at Greer, who nodded once. Vesper shrugged, but there was no refusal in it. Flint turned back to Marlowe. Then we'll be there, front row, like you said. Marlowe's face lit up with the first genuine smile Celeste had seen since the crash. But as they rode away, engines rumbling into the gathering dusk, none of them knew what that promise would cost, or what it would reveal about honor, judgment, and the silent war between reputation and truth. Ridgemont, Montana was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, your business, and your grandfather's sins. Population 3, 847. 3 churches, 2 bars, 1 elementary school. Main Street stretched exactly 7 blocks, lined with brick buildings that hadn't changed since 1952. The hardware store still had the same faded awning, the library still closed at 3 p.m. on Thursdays, and the people still believed that respectability was measured by how quietly you lived your life. Marlowe Thorne, didn't fit Ridgemont's definition of quiet. She'd arrived in September, a broken little girl with haunted eyes, and been placed with Celeste Hargrove, a widow who ran a small horse ranch on the outskirts of town. Celeste had fostered 4 children over the years, each one damaged in ways that made the town whisper, but she took them anyway because she believed broken things deserved a chance to heal. Marlowe was different from the others. She didn't cry, didn't rage, didn't test boundaries like traumatized children usually did. Instead, she withdrew into herself, speaking only when necessary, spending hours in the barn talking to horses who never judged. Never left, never promised things they couldn't keep, until the play auditions. Mrs. Everly, the elementary school drama teacher, had been directing the winter production for 17 years. She was a woman of rigid standards and even more rigid opinions, the kind of teacher who believed discipline shaped character and that children should be seen performing, not heard complaining. When Marlowe auditioned for the role of Clara in A Winter's Promise, a saccharine story about a girl who saves Christmas through the power of believing, Mrs. Everly had been skeptical. Foster children, in her experience, lacked the stability required for lead roles. They missed rehearsals, had emotional outbursts, complicated home lives that interfered with commitment. But when Marlowe spoke her lines, something shifted. Her voice carried a weight that 7-year-olds shouldn't possess, the kind of gravity that comes from understanding loss on a cellular level. She delivered the final monologue, about finding family in unexpected places, with such raw honesty that the auditorium fell completely silent. Mrs. Everly gave her the role, though she'd later claim it was only because no other child had bothered to memorize the full script. Rehearsals began in early November. Marlowe threw herself into the role with an intensity that surprised everyone. She arrived early, stayed late, practiced her lines in the barn until the horses could probably recite them. For the first time since the crash, she seemed to care about something beyond survival. Then came the parent meeting. Mrs. Everly gathered the families in the school cafeteria, outlining the production schedule, costume requirements, ticket sales. At the end, she opened the floor for questions. That's when Margaret Stinson, mother of 3, president of the PTA and self-appointed moral authority of Ridgemont, raised her hand. "I have a concern," Margaret said, her voice dripping with false sweetness, "about our lead actress." The room fell quiet. Celeste, sitting in the back row, felt her stomach tighten. "Marlowe Thorne is, of course, a very talented child," Margaret continued, "but given her circumstances, I wonder if she's the right representation for our school. A foster child with no stable family, playing the role of Clara, who ultimately finds her place with her loving parents." She shook her head. "It seems almost cruel, doesn't it, setting her up for that kind of emotional confusion?" Other parents murmured agreement. Someone mentioned behavioral concerns. Another wondered if Marlowe would follow through with the commitment. The conversation spiraled, each comment a small knife disguised as concern. Mrs. Everly held up her hand. "Marlowe earned this role through merit. Unless there's a legitimate issue with her performance or behavior, she remains our Clara." Margaret's smile tightened. "Of course, I'm simply thinking of the child's well-being." But Celeste knew better. This wasn't about Marlowe's well-being. This was about Ridgemont's obsession with appearances, with maintaining the illusion that only certain kinds of families produced certain kinds of children. That night, Celeste found Marlowe in the barn, brushing a mare named Juniper with methodical precision. "They don't want me in the play," Marlowe said without looking up. "Who told you that?" "I heard Mrs. Stinson talking to another mom after rehearsal. She said foster kids always cause problems." Marlowe's hand stilled on the brush. "She said people like me don't belong center stage." Celeste knelt beside her, fighting the rage building in her chest. "Marlowe, look at me." The little girl turned. her eyes ancient in that too young face. "You earned that role," Celeste said firmly, "and you're going to shine in it no matter what anyone says. You hear me?" Marlowe nodded, but the light that had been growing in her eyes since she got the part had dimmed. The following Tuesday, during lunch period, 3 girls cornered Marlowe by the playground swings. They were led by Caitlin Stinson, Margaret's daughter, 11 years old, with her mother's cruel smile and her father's sense of entitlement. "My mum says you're going to ruin the play," Caitlin said, her voice sing-song sweet. "Because foster kids don't have real families, so you can't pretend to care about finding one." The other girls giggled. One of them, a blonde named Presley, added, "Plus, you don't even have anyone coming to watch you. That's so sad." Marlowe's hands clenched into fists. "I have someone coming." "Who? Your pretend mom?" Caitlin laughed. "Everyone knows Mrs. Hargrove only takes in foster kids for the money. She doesn't actually care about you." "That's not true," Marlowe said, her voice shaking. "Prove it then. Who's coming to watch you?" And that's when Marlowe said it, the words that would set everything in motion. The Hells Angels, 18 of them, front row. The playground went silent. Caitlin's smile faltered. "You're lying." "They saved my life," Marlowe said, her voice steady now, fueled by something deeper than anger. "They made me a promise, and they're coming." By final period, the entire school knew. By dinner time, half of Ridgemont had heard, and by the time Mrs. Everly received a phone call from the school principal that evening, the town had already divided itself into 2 camps. Those who believed a 7-year-old foster child was inventing stories for attention, and those who were terrified she might be telling the truth. Neither side knew what was actually coming. Because Flint and his crew weren't just showing up for a school play, they were showing up to honor a promise, and in doing so, they'd expose every hypocritical judgment that Ridgemont had built its identity upon. The stage was set, the lines were drawn, and Marlowe Thorne, the girl nobody wanted in the spotlight, was about to teach an entire town what honor actually looked like. Principal Garrison's office smelled like old coffee and anxiety. Celeste sat across from his desk, her hands folded in her lap, while Mrs. Everly perched on a chair by the window, her expression carved from stone. Between them sat an uncomfortable silence that had lasted 3 full minutes, Garrison clearly searching for the right words to deliver bad news diplomatically. "Mrs. Hargrove," he finally began, adjusting his glasses, "we need to discuss Marlowe's guests." "You mean the men who saved her life?" Celeste's voice was calm, but her eyes held steel. Garrison shifted. "I understand there's a personal connection, but surely you can see our position. A motorcycle club, specifically the Hells Angels, attending a children's elementary school production creates concerns." "What concerns?" Celeste asked. "That parents might actually have to confront their prejudices?" Mrs. Everly interjected, her tone clipped. "This isn't about prejudice. It's about safety, appropriateness. We have 200 children in this building, and parents have the right to feel their children are in a secure environment." "Marlowe feels secure around them," Celeste countered. "More secure than she's felt anywhere else since her mother abandoned her." Garrison held up his hands. "I'm not questioning Marlowe's experience, but we've received 17 phone calls from concerned parents. The Stinsons are threatening to pull their daughter from the production. The Reverend from First Baptist called to ask if we're endorsing criminal organizations." He rubbed his temples. "This is escalating." "Because you're letting it escalate," Celeste said. "These men pulled my foster daughter from a burning vehicle. They asked for nothing in return. They made her a promise, and they're keeping it. That's more than most people in this town have ever done for her. But their reputation is just that. Reputation. None of those parents calling to complain have ever met these men. They're judging based on vests and motorcycles and fear of anything that doesn't fit their narrow definition of acceptable." Mrs. Everleigh leaned forward. Mrs. Hargrove, I sympathize. But I have to consider all my students, not just Marlowe. If having these men attend creates a hostile environment— For who? Celeste interrupted. For Marlowe, or for the parents who'd rather their children learn to judge books by their covers? The room fell silent again. Outside, the November wind rattled the window frames. Finally, Garrison spoke, his voice heavy. I'm not cancelling Marlowe's invitation, but I am implementing additional security measures. Campus security will be on site. And I'm informing the county sheriff's department of the situation, just in case. Celeste stood, her chair scraping against the floor. You do what you need to do, Principal Garrison. But those men will be in that auditorium, front row, watching a little girl who's had everything taken from her perform in her first school play. And if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. She walked out, leaving the door open behind her. That evening, Marlowe sat at Celeste's kitchen table, a bowl of untouched soup cooling in front of her. She'd overheard enough whispered conversations to understand what was happening. The school was panicking, the parents were angry, the town was treating her invitation like a declaration of war. Maybe I shouldn't have asked them to come, Marlowe said quietly. Celeste sat down beside her. Why do you say that? Everyone's mad. Mrs. Everleigh looked at me weird today. Caitlin's telling everyone I'm trying to bring criminals to school. Marlowe's voice cracked. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'm causing problems. Marlowe, look at me. The little girl raised her eyes. You are not causing problems, Celeste said firmly. You extended an invitation to people who were there for you when it mattered. That's called loyalty. That's called gratitude. Those are good things, no matter what anyone else says. But what if they don't come? What if all this fighting scares them away? Celeste smiled. Honey, men who ride into burning crashes to save children they don't know, those aren't men who scare easily. She was right. That same night, 240 miles south, in a garage that doubled as the Angels' clubhouse, Flint stood before his assembled crew. 18 men total, ranging from Vesper at 26 to Greer at 53. Some were veterans, some were ex-cons, some were just men who'd found family where blood relations failed them. We got a situation, Flint said, holding up the play flyer Marlowe had given him. That kid from the crash, Marlowe. She invited us to her school play, front row. Vesper snorted. Let me guess, the town's losing its mind. Pretty much, Celeste, the foster mom called me, says the school's bringing in extra security. Parents are threatening to pull their kids, whole 9 yards. Flint's jaw tightened. They're treating us like we're rolling in to rob the place instead of watch a 7-year-old in a costume. So what do we do? Asked Cypher, a lean man with burn scars running down his left arm. Back out, let the kid down. No. Flint's voice left no room for argument. We made her a promise. We keep it. Even if the cops show up, Greer asked. Because they will. Especially if the cops show up, Flint said. We're not doing anything wrong. We're watching a school play. If that scares people, that's their problem, not ours. Vesper leaned back in his chair. You know how this looks, though, right? 18 bikers rolling into small-town Montana for a kid's play. They're gonna think we're making some kind of statement. We are, Flint said. We're saying that we keep our word. We're saying that a 7-year-old who lost everything gets to have someone in that audience who gives a damn about her. And we're saying that just because we don't look like what respectable people think heroes should look like, doesn't mean we can't be exactly that. Silence filled the garage. Then Greer stood, nodding once. I'm in. One by one, the others followed. Vesper, Cypher, Rowan, Nash, Evade, all 18, committing to a promise that would cost them nothing but prejudice and judgment, small prices for men who'd already paid larger debts. December 3rd, Flint said, we ride clean. No colors that'll spook civilians beyond the vests. We show up, We watch the play, we applaud like any other family, and we remind that town that family isn't just blood, it's who shows up when it counts. And now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact hour you heard this story. We wish to know how far these northern confessions travel and at what moments they reach you. The announcement came on Monday morning. Principal Garrison stood before the assembled elementary school, his voice amplified through the ancient PA system that crackled with static. Students fidgeted in their rows, teachers stood like sentinels along the walls, and in the back corner, Marlowe sat with her hands clenched in her lap. "As many of you know," Garrison began, "our winter production is this Friday evening. We're expecting a wonderful performance from all our students. However, I want to address some concerns that have been raised regarding attendance." The gymnasium fell silent. "We welcome all family members and friends of our students. That said, we will have additional security measures in place to ensure everyone's safety and comfort. Campus security will be monitoring the premises, and we ask that all attendees check in at the main entrance before proceeding to the auditorium." He didn't say the words "Hell's Angels," but he didn't need to. Every parent in that room knew exactly what and who those measures were for. After assembly, Marlowe walked to her classroom alone. Usually she kept her head down, made herself small, stayed invisible, but today she felt eyes following her, students whispering behind hands, teachers exchanging meaningful glances, judgment condensing in the air like humidity before a storm. By lunch period, the whispers had crystallized into confrontations. Marlowe sat at her usual table in the corner, eating a peanut butter sandwich that tasted like cardboard, when Caitlin Stinson approached with her 2 satellite friends. "My mom says you're ruining the play for everyone," Caitlin announced, loud enough that nearby tables fell quiet. Marlowe kept eating, refusing to look up. "She says real families come to plays, not gangs of criminals." Caitlin leaned closer. "You're just making stuff up because you're embarrassed that nobody actually cares about you." "They're coming," Marlowe said quietly. "Sure they are." Caitlin's voice dripped sarcasm. "And I bet they're really excited to watch some stupid play about Christmas when they could be out doing whatever criminals do." Marlowe finally looked up, her eyes meeting Caitlin's. "They saved my life. They pulled me from a burning car when nobody else would. They made me a promise, and they keep their promises. That's more than I can say for most people." The words hung in the air. For a moment, Caitlin seemed uncertain, her rehearsed cruelty faltering. Then she recovered, laughing. "You're delusional." But she walked away and she didn't come back. That evening, Celeste received a visit. The knock came just after dinner. Celeste opened the door to find Sheriff Dominic Reeve standing on her porch, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. Behind him, the winter sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood orange. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said, "got a minute?" Celeste stepped outside, closing the door behind her. Marlowe was upstairs practicing her lines. She didn't need to hear this conversation. "I assume this is about Friday," Celeste said. Reeve nodded. "Just wanted to give you a heads up. I'll have 2 deputies at the school during the performance. Nothing aggressive, just a presence. But if those bikers cause any trouble—" "They won't," Celeste interrupted. "They're coming to watch a child's play, not start a riot." "I understand that's your belief," Reeve said carefully. "But I've got 17 families who've called demanding protection. I've got a principal worried about liability, and I've got a responsibility to keep the peace." He paused. "These men you're vouching for, do you actually know them? Or are you basing this on one good deed?" "I'm basing it on the fact that they didn't have to stop at that crash," Celeste said. "They didn't have to pull Marlowe out. They didn't have to promise to check on her. But they did. And now they're honoring that promise, despite an entire town treating them like criminals before they've even arrived. Reeve studied her for a long moment. You know what I think? I think you're a good woman who's been burned by the foster system so many times that you've stopped seeing red flags when they're waving right in front of you. Or maybe I've learned to see character where others only see reputation, Celeste countered. The sheriff replaced his hat. Friday night, 7 p.m. My deputies will be there. Let's hope we all walk away with nothing more than applause and curtain calls. He drove away, leaving Celeste standing in the cold. The week dragged forward like a wounded animal. Wednesday brought a town hall meeting where Margaret Stinson gave an impassioned speech about protecting our children from dangerous influences while carefully avoiding any mention of Marlowe by name. Thursday brought an editorial in the Ridgemont Gazette titled When Charity Becomes Recklessness, a thinly veiled criticism of Celeste's decision to allow known criminals access to school property. Through it all, Marlowe attended rehearsals. She practiced her lines. She worked with the other cast members, most of whom now avoided eye contact. She became a ghost in her own play, present but invisible, her role as Clara feeling increasingly ironic, given that Clara's whole story revolved around finally being seen. Mrs. Everly pulled her aside on Thursday afternoon, just as rehearsal ended. Marlowe, I want you to know that regardless of what's happening outside these walls, you've earned your place in this production, she said. You're a talented young actress. Don't let anyone make you forget that. It was the kindest thing any adult at school had said to her all week. Are you mad they're coming? Marlowe asked. Mrs. Everly hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I'm concerned about the disruption, but I'm not mad at you. You didn't create this situation. The adults did with their fear and their judgment. She knelt down, meeting Marlowe's eyes. Promise me something. When you're on that stage Friday night, you forget about everything else. You forget the whispers, the security guards, the parents watching with crossed arms. You just be Clara. You tell her story the way you've been telling it in rehearsal. Can you do that? Marlowe nodded. Good, because that's how you win. Not by fighting back, but by being so undeniably good at what you do that no one can dismiss it. That night, Marlowe lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of her small room in Celeste's farmhouse. Outside, wind howled across the Montana plains. Inside, doubt whispered in her ear. What if they didn't come? What if the whole town's anger scared them away? What if Friday arrived and the front row sat empty, proving Caitlin and Mrs. Stinson and everyone else right, that she was just a foster kid making up stories, desperate for someone to care? She pulled Celeste's old quilt tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes. But sleep didn't come easy. And when it did, she dreamed of burning cars and empty auditoriums and a stage where nobody clapped. Friday morning arrived with frost on the windows and tension thick enough to taste. Marlowe woke before dawn, her stomach a knot of nerves that had nothing to do with stage fright. She dressed mechanically. Jeans, her favorite sweater with the horse on the front, sneakers that were getting too small, but she refused to admit it. Downstairs, Celeste had made pancakes, but Marlowe could barely manage 3 bites. You're going to be amazing tonight, Celeste said, watching her push food around her plate. What if they don't come? The words tumbled out before Marlowe could stop them. What if everyone's right? And they were just being nice when they said they would. What if I'm sitting backstage waiting and the front row is empty? Celeste set down her coffee mug, her expression firm. Marlowe, look at me. The little girl raised her eyes. Those men pulled you from a burning car, Celeste said. They didn't know you. They didn't know if you had family, money, anything worth saving by society's standards. They saved you because it was the right thing to do. Men like that don't break promises, especially not to 7-year-olds. But everyone's so angry. Let them be angry. Their anger says more about them than it does about those bikers. You extended an invitation with a pure heart. Whatever happens is on the adults, not you. School that day was surreal. Final dress rehearsal ran during the afternoon. The auditorium transformed with hand-painted backdrops of snow-covered villages and Christmas markets. Marlowe moved through her blocking like she was underwater, present but detached, her mind already racing ahead to 7 p.m. During lunch, she overheard 2 teachers talking in the hallway. "I heard the sheriff's bringing 4 deputies now, not 2, one said. Margaret Stinson convinced half the PTA to sit in the back near the exits, the other replied, in case they need to evacuate quickly. Evacuate? From what? 18 men watching a children's play? You know how people are. They see leather vests and tattoos and assume the worst. Still, that poor little girl. Imagine finally having someone show up for you and having the whole town treat it like a threat." Marlowe moved on before they noticed her. The final bell rang at 3:15 p.m. Students flooded out, heading home to prepare for the evening performance. Marlowe stayed behind, helping Mrs. Everly set up chairs and test the stage lights. Anything to keep her hands busy, her mind from spinning into worst-case scenarios. At 4:30 p.m., Celeste picked her up. They drove home in silence, the Montana landscape rolling past, dormant fields, bare trees, the occasional ranch house with smoke curling from its chimney. At 5:00 p.m., 240 miles south, Flint's phone rang. He answered to find Celeste's voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I just wanted to confirm," she said. "You're still coming tonight?" "Yes, ma'am. Wouldn't miss it. Because if you've changed your mind, if this is too much trouble, I need to know now. I need to prepare Marlowe." Flint's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Hargrove, we made a promise to that kid. Weather, distance, angry parents, police presence, none of that changes our word. We'll be there. Front row, all 18 of us." Celeste exhaled, the relief palpable even over the phone. "Thank you. You have no idea what this means to her." "I think I do," Flint said quietly. "See you at 7. He hung up and turned to the assembled crew. They were already gearing up, leather vests over clean shirts, boots polished, bikes checked and ready. No weapons, no alcohol, nothing that could be misconstrued. They were riding in clean, respectful, and prepared for whatever judgment waited. "Last chance to back out," Flint said, though his tone made it clear backing out wasn't actually an option. No one moved. "Then let's ride." 18 motorcycles roared to life, the sound echoing through the garage like approaching thunder. They pulled out in formation, Flint in front, Greer and Vesper flanking, the others falling into a tight convoy behind. The sun was setting as they hit the highway, painting the sky in shades of copper and violet. They rode through small towns that blurred together, gas stations, diners, churches with marquees promising salvation. They rode through open plains, where the wind tried to push them off course, but they leaned into it, steady and unwavering. They rode with purpose, because somewhere ahead, a 7-year-old girl was counting on them to keep a promise that most adults wouldn't bother to remember. At 6:15 p.m., Marlowe stood in the elementary school girl's bathroom, staring at her reflection. She wore her Clara costume, a simple white dress with blue trim, her hair pulled back with a ribbon Mrs. Everly had helped tie. She looked like any other 7-year-old about to perform in a school play, but her eyes told a different story. They held the weight of every broken promise, every empty chair, every time someone had said they'd be there and then disappeared like smoke. Mrs. Everly found her there, gripping the sink edge. 5 minutes to places, the teacher said gently. "You ready?" "I don't know," Marlowe whispered. Mrs. Everly knelt beside her. "Stage fright? What if they don't come? Then you perform for everyone who did come," Mrs. Everly said. "You perform for yourself. You perform because you earned this role and you've worked hard and you deserve to tell this story. Understand?" Marlowe nodded, but her hands were shaking. Outside, the auditorium was filling. Parents filed in, some excited, some wary, some openly hostile. Margaret Stinson sat in the back row with 3 other PTA mothers, their expressions grim. Sheriff Reeves stood by the entrance with 4 deputies, scanning every arrival like they were searching for terrorists instead of theatre patrons. The front row sat empty. At 6:45 p.m., people began checking their watches. Whispers spread through the crowd. "See? They're not coming. I told you it was made up. That poor delusional child." Celeste sat in the second row, her stomach churning. She checked her phone, no messages. The clock on the auditorium wall ticked towards 7. At 6:52 p.m., the first rumble echoed from outside, then another and another, until the sound was unmistakable, motorcycles approaching in formation, their engines a rolling thunder that shook the auditorium windows. Conversations died mid-sentence. Parents turned toward the entrance. Sheriff Reeves' hand dropped to his belt instinctively, though his weapon remained holstered. At 6:55 p.m., the auditorium doors opened. Flint walked in first, his massive frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Greer, Vesper, and 15 others. 18 men total, leather vests bearing the rocker patch that made hearts skip beats and prejudices crystallize. They moved with quiet confidence, not aggressive, but absolutely certain of their right to be there. They walked past the sheriff and his deputies, past the whispering parents, past Margaret Stinson's horrified expression. They walked to the front row, the row that had sat empty all evening, the row everyone had assumed would remain that way, and they sat down, all 18 of them. Front row center, right where Marlowe had asked them to be. The auditorium fell silent. Backstage, Mrs. Everly knocked on the dressing room door. "Marlowe, they're here!" The little girl's head snapped up. "What?" "Your guests. Front row, all of them." Marlowe ran to the curtain's edge, peering out. There in the front row she saw them. Flint, Greer, Vesper, every single one of them. They'd kept their promise. For the first time in months, Marlowe Thorne smiled with her whole heart. The lights dimmed, the curtain prepared to rise, and in that small elementary school in Ridgemont, Montana, a truth was about to unfold that would challenge every assumption, every prejudice, every judgment that town had built its identity upon. Because sometimes the people who look most dangerous are actually the only ones brave enough to show up when it matters. The stage lights came up slowly, bathing the painted backdrop in warm gold. Marlowe stood in the wings, her heart hammering so hard she was certain the entire auditorium could hear it. Mrs. Everly gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze, then whispered, "Remember, you're Clara. Tell her story." The opening scene began. Other children took their positions. The townspeople, the shopkeepers, the chorus singing about winter and hope and the magic of believing. Marlowe waited for her cue. Her entrance coming in scene 2, when Clara first appears alone in the village square, searching for something she's lost. The narrator, an 8th grader named Rowan, spoke into the microphone. And then came Clara, a child who carried winter in her heart, searching for the one thing she'd lost, a reason to believe. Marlowe stepped onto the stage. The lights shifted, focusing on her small figure center stage. She wore the white dress with blue trim, her hair ribbon catching the light. For a moment, she froze, not from fear, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that this was real. She was here. And in the front row, 18 leather-clad bikers sat watching, their presence solid and unwavering. Then she saw Flint. He gave her the smallest nod, just enough to be noticed, and somehow that single gesture grounded her. Marlowe began to speak. "I've walked these streets 100 times," she said, her voice clear and steady, "searching for something I cannot name. The shopkeepers smile, but their smiles are empty. The townspeople wave, but their waves mean nothing, because what I'm looking for isn't here. It's somewhere I've never been. Her delivery was flawless. Not robotic, but natural, infused with the kind of authenticity that can't be taught, only lived. Every word carried weight because Marlowe understood Clara's loneliness on a molecular level. She wasn't acting, she was remembering. The play continued. Clara meets the toy maker, played by a sixth grader named Ezra, who tells her that belief creates family. She meets the winter spirit, a dramatic fifth grader who took the role very seriously, who teaches her that magic exists in promises kept. And finally, she finds the lost children, kids like her, abandoned or forgotten, who've built their own family from the pieces of their broken pasts. It was, on paper, a saccharine Christmas story meant to end with tears and applause. But with Marlowe in the lead, it became something else entirely. It became a meditation on chosen family, on the courage it takes to trust again after betrayal, on the quiet power of people who show up when no one expects them to. In the audience, something shifted. Parents who'd arrived with crossed arms and suspicious glances found themselves leaning forward. Children sat mesmerized. Even Margaret Stinson, determined to find fault, couldn't deny that the little foster girl on stage was delivering a performance that transcended her own expectations. And in the front row, 18 bikers watched in complete silence. Flint's eyes never left Marlowe. Greer sat with his scarred hands folded in his lap, utterly still. Vesper, who usually wore perpetual skepticism like armor, had softened, his expression unguarded in a way his crew rarely saw. They weren't watching a school play. They were watching a child they'd saved show the world that she was worth saving. Scene 4 arrived. Clara's monologue, the emotional centerpiece of the production. She stood alone on stage, a single spotlight illuminating her, and spoke directly to the audience. People think family is blood. They think it's the name you're given or the house you're born into. But I've learned something different. I've learned that family is who stays when staying is hard. Family is who pulls you from the wreckage when everyone else drives by. Family is who remembers your name when the world forgets. Her voice cracked on the last line, not because she'd rehearsed it that way, but because the truth of the words overwhelmed her. Tears slid down her cheeks, real tears, not stage tears, and she didn't wipe them away. "My family isn't perfect," she continued, her voice stronger now. "They don't wear matching sweaters or sit for portraits. They don't always say the right things or know how to fix what's broken, but they show up, and sometimes that's the only magic that matters." The auditorium was silent. Even the deputies standing by the exits had stopped scanning the crowd, their attention captured by the small girl speaking truth in the guise of fiction. Marlowe delivered the final line of the monologue. "So I stopped looking for what I lost, because I finally found what I needed." The spotlight faded, the scene transitioned, but the impact lingered. Backstage during the intermission, Mrs. Everly found Marlowe sitting on a prop box, drinking water with shaking hands. "That was extraordinary," the teacher said. "I've directed this play for 17 years, and I've never seen that monologue delivered with that much honesty." "I was thinking about them," Marlowe said quietly, gesturing toward the front row, "about how they didn't have to stop, how they could have kept driving, but they didn't." Mrs. Everly knelt down. "You know what I realized tonight? I was wrong about a lot of things, about reputation, about who deserves to be honored. Those men out there, they faced more judgment in one evening than most people face in a lifetime, and they still showed up. For you." Marlowe nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. The second act began. The plot thickened. Clara and the lost children face the winter's doubt, a shadowy figure representing everyone who's ever said they're not worthy of love. It was melodramatic, designed for 7 to 12-year-olds, but Marlowe played it with such conviction that it transcended the material. The climax arrived. Clara, surrounded by doubt and darkness, makes a choice. She chooses to believe in the family she's found, even when believing feels impossible. She speaks the final spell, not magic words, but a simple declaration. You stayed. That's enough. The darkness lifts. The lost children are saved. And Clara, for the first time in the play, smiles without reservation. The final scene was a tableau. All the characters on stage, singing the closing song about promises and family, and winter turning to spring. Marlowe stood center stage, flanked by the other children, her voice rising with theirs. As the final note hung in the air, she made eye contact with Flint. He didn't smile, that wasn't his way, but his eyes said everything. We're proud of you. You did it. You're not alone. The lights faded to black. For 3 full seconds, the auditorium sat in silence. Then the applause began. It started with the front row, 18 bikers standing in unison, clapping with a rhythm that sounded like approaching thunder. Then the second row joined, then the third. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applause building to a crescendo that shook the rafters. Parents who'd arrived skeptical found themselves clapping until their hands hurt. Children shouted Marlowe's name. Even Sheriff Reeve, standing by the exit, was applauding, his expression one of surprised respect. The curtain rose for bows. The cast filed out, taking their applause. When Marlowe stepped forward for her solo bow, the volume somehow increased, a roar of approval that acknowledged not just her performance, but her courage, her resilience, her refusal to let judgment dim her light. She curtsied, her white dress swirling, and when she rose, she looked directly at the front row and mouthed 2 words. Thank you. Flint nodded once. Message received. Promise kept. If you're enjoying this story, please tap the like button. It helps us know these Northern confessions matter to you. The auditorium slowly emptied, parents herding excited children toward exits, cast members disappearing backstage to change out of costumes. But in the front row, 18 bikers remained seated, waiting. Marlowe burst through the stage door, still wearing her Clara dress, her makeup smudged from tears and sweat. She ran straight to Flint, who'd stood when he saw her coming. She crashed into him with the full force of a 7-year-old's gratitude, her small arms wrapping around his waist. You came, she said, voice muffled against his leather vest. You really came. But Flint's massive hand rested gently on her head. Told you we would. We don't break promises, kid. The other bikers gathered around. Greer crouched down to Marlowe's level. You were incredible up there. Best performance I've seen in, well, ever. Vesper, usually so guarded, actually smiled. That monologue, when you talked about family showing up, you weren't acting, were you? Marlowe shook her head. I was thinking about you, about the crash, about how you didn't have to stop, but you did. That's what makes it real, Vesper said. The best performances come from truth, not technique. Around them, the auditorium dynamics had shifted. Parents who'd arrived with locked jaws and crossed arms now watched the interaction with something approaching curiosity. The bikers weren't loud or threatening. They weren't demanding attention or making statements. They were simply being present for a child who'd asked them to be. Mrs. Everly approached. Her usual stern expression softened. I owe you gentlemen an apology, she said. I let fear and reputation color my judgment. What you did tonight, showing up despite the hostility, took more courage than most people have. Flint nodded acknowledgement. We're just here for the kid, Mom. Nothing more complicated than that. Still, Mrs. Everly said, it means something. To her especially, but also to everyone watching. She glanced at Marlowe. You taught this whole town a lesson tonight about character and loyalty. I hope they were paying attention. Some were, some weren't. Margaret Stinson stood in the back of the auditorium with her cluster of PTA mothers, their expressions ranging from confused to grudgingly impressed to still defensive. Caitlin hovered nearby, stealing glances at the front row scene with something that might have been shame flickering across her face. Sheriff Reeve dismissed his deputies, then walked to where Flint stood. The two men sized each other up, not hostile, but wary, like wolves deciding if territory would be contested. "No trouble tonight," Reeve said. It wasn't quite a question. "No trouble," Flint confirmed. "Just a promise kept." Reeve studied him for a long moment. "I misjudged you. I assumed, well, it doesn't matter what I assumed. What matters is you proved me wrong. That doesn't happen often." "With respect, Sheriff, we weren't trying to prove anything," Flint said. "We were just being there for a kid who needed someone to be there. Shouldn't require courage, should just be basic human decency." "You're right," Reeve admitted. "It should be. But in this town, apparently it does." He extended his hand. "Thank you for coming, and for handling the reception with more grace than it deserved." Flint shook his hand once, firm but brief. As the sheriff walked away, Celeste appeared, having waited for the crowd to thin. She approached the bikers with tears in her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You showed up knowing you'd face judgment. You sat through stares and whispers and probably worse, and you did it anyway, for a little girl you barely know." "We know her enough," Greer said simply. "We pulled her from that crash. We made her a promise. That's all the knowing required." Celeste turned to Marlowe. "Honey, why don't you go change out of your costume? I'll wait here." Marlowe hesitated, clearly not wanting to leave the bikers, but eventually nodded and ran backstage. Once she was gone, Celeste lowered her voice. "Can I ask you something? Why? You didn't have to stop at that crash. You didn't have to promise to check on her. You didn't have to come tonight. So why?" The bikers exchanged glances. Finally, Vesper spoke. "Because we've all been that kid," he said. "Maybe not literally in a burning car, but metaphorically. Yeah, we've all been the ones people drove past, the ones written off, the ones judged by our circumstances instead of our character." He paused. "And if someone had stopped for us, really stopped, not just slowed down, it might have changed everything. So when we saw that crash, we stopped. Because we wish someone had stopped for us." The simple honesty of it rendered Celeste speechless. Flint added, "Plus she's a good kid, smart, resilient, stronger than most adults I know. She deserved to have someone in that audience who was there for her, not for politics or appearances. We were happy to be those people." Marlowe returned wearing jeans and her horse sweater, her face scrubbed clean of stage makeup. She carried a folded piece of paper, which she handed to Flint. "I drew this for you," she said shyly. "It's not very good, but—" Flint unfolded it carefully. The drawing showed 18 stick-figure motorcycles and a small girl in the center. Above it, in careful 7-year-old handwriting, "My family." Something shifted in Flint's expression. A crack in the armor, a glimpse of vulnerability he usually kept buried. "It's perfect," he said quietly. "I'll keep it forever." They stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about the play, about Marlowe's plans she wanted to try out for the spring musical, about small things that mattered in ways big things never could. Around them, the auditorium gradually emptied until only the janitor remained, sweeping the aisles with patient efficiency. Finally, Flint checked his watch. "We should head out. Long ride home." Marlowe's face fell. "Will I see you again?" "Yeah, kid. We'll check in. And if you're ever in trouble, I mean real trouble, you call this number." He handed her a card with his contact information. "Day or night, understand?" Marlowe nodded, clutching the card like a lifeline. They walked out together, the 18 bikers, the little girl, and the foster mother who'd believed in both. Outside, the Montana night was cold and clear, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The motorcycles sat in a neat row, chrome gleaming under the parking lot lights. Marlowe hugged each biker in turn, her small arms barely reaching around their waists. They accepted her affection with surprising gentleness. These men, whose reputations screamed danger, but whose actions whispered protection. Finally, she reached Flint. "Thank you," she said again, "for everything." Flint knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "You did good tonight. Not just on stage, though that was incredible, but by having the courage to ask us to come. You didn't let their judgment stop you from honoring your truth. That takes guts." "I was scared they were right," Marlowe admitted, "that you wouldn't come." "We'll always come," Flint said. "That's what family does. They show up. Remember that." Marlowe nodded, committing the words to memory. The bikers mounted their motorcycles. 18 engines roared to life, the sound no longer threatening, but somehow comforting, a promise of protection, of presence, of people who keep their word. They rode away in formation, disappearing into the Montana night, their taillights fading like falling stars. Marlowe stood in the parking lot long after they'd gone, Celeste's arm around her shoulders, both of them watching the empty road. "You okay?" Celeste asked. "Yeah," Marlowe said, and she meant it. For the first time since the crash, since her mother disappeared, since the world revealed itself as a place where promises often break, she meant it. Because 18 bikers had kept their word, and that single act of loyalty had rewritten her understanding of what family could be. Monday morning arrived with unexpected consequences. Marlowe walked into Ridgemont Elementary, expecting the same cold shoulders and sideways glances that had defined her previous weeks. Instead, she found something different: curiosity. Not hostile, genuinely curious. 3 girls from her grade approached during morning recess. One of them, a quiet kid named Senna, who usually kept to herself, said, "My mum said you were really good in the play, and that the bikers who came were, actually nice." Marlowe blinked, caught off guard. "Yeah, they are. Caitlin said they were criminals." "Caitlin doesn't know them," Marlowe replied quietly. "They saved my life. They're my friends." Senna nodded slowly. "That's cool, that you have friends like that." It was a small moment, but it mattered. For the first time since arriving in Ridgemont, Marlowe felt less like an outsider and more like someone whose story was worth knowing. The shift wasn't universal. Margaret Stinson still glared when she saw Celeste at drop-off. The PTA mothers still whispered. But cracks had formed in Ridgemont's united front of judgment, and through those cracks, something resembling understanding began to seep. Principal Garrison called Celeste Tuesday afternoon. His tone was different, less defensive, more reflective. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for the security measures, for treating those men like threats instead of guests. I let fear override common sense." "They handled it with grace," Celeste said. "They did, and frankly they showed more character than most of us." He paused. "I've been thinking about what happened, about how quickly we judged. I'd like to use this as a teaching moment, if you and Marlowe are comfortable with that." "What did you have in mind?" "An assembly, about preconceptions and character, about looking beyond appearances." He hesitated. "With your permission, I'd like Marlowe to speak. Nothing formal, just share her experience. Sometimes children teach better lessons than adults." Celeste promised to ask Marlowe. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with hot chocolate between them, Celeste broached the subject. Marlowe listened, her expression thoughtful. "Would I have to talk about the crash?" she asked. "Only if you wanted to. You could just talk about friendship, about promises kept." Marlowe stirred her hot chocolate, watching the marshmallows melt. "I think I want to," she finally said, "because maybe other kids feel like I did, like nobody sees them, and maybe hearing that someone showed up for me will help them believe someone will show up for them too." The assembly happened Friday morning. The entire elementary school, kindergarten through 6th grade, filed into the gymnasium. Teachers stood along the walls. Principal Garrison took the microphone first, speaking about judgment and character, about the difference between reputation and reality. Then he called Marlowe to the podium. She walked across the gymnasium floor, her footsteps echoing. Someone had placed a small step stool behind the microphone so she could reach it. She climbed up, gripped the podium's edge, and looked out at 3 to 12 faces, staring back. "My name is Marlowe," she began, her voice amplified and slightly shaky. "3 months ago I was in a car crash. The car caught fire. I thought I was going to die." The gymnasium fell silent. Then I heard motorcycles. 18 men stopped. Men, they didn't know me, didn't owe me anything. They pulled me out. They saved my life. She paused, gathering courage. Later, I found out they were Hell's Angels, and I found out that some people in this town thought that made them bad, dangerous criminals. A few parents shifted uncomfortably, but those men kept their promise to check on me. And when I asked them to come to my play, they came. They sat through stares and whispers, and police watching them like they'd done something wrong. They came because they said they would. Marlowe's voice grew stronger. I learned something from them. I learned that family isn't who shares your blood or your last name. Family is who shows up when showing up is hard. Family is who keeps promises when breaking them would be easier. She looked directly at Caitlin Stinson, who sat 3 rows back, unable to meet her eyes. And I learned that judging people by how they look, instead of what they do, makes you miss the best people you'll ever meet. She stepped down. The applause started slowly, then built, genuine, not obligatory. Teachers nodded. Students whispered among themselves. And in the back, even Margaret Stinson had tears in her eyes, though she'd never admit why. That weekend, something unexpected happened. Flint received a call from Sheriff Reeve. "Got a situation?" the sheriff said. "Teen kid from Ridgemont ran away 3 days ago. 15 years old. History of foster placements. Last seen heading south on Route 9. His foster parents are worried. Kid's diabetic, doesn't have his insulin." "Why are you calling me?" Flint asked. "Because your crew knows those highways better than anyone. And because after last Friday, I realized I've been an idiot about who my allies could be." Reeves' voice was humble. "I'm asking for help. Will you ride?" Flint called his crew. Within an hour, 18 motorcycles were searching the highways and truck stops between Ridgemont and the state line. They found the kid at a rest stop 40 miles south, cold, scared, blood sugar dropping. Vesper called the ambulance while Greer stayed with the boy, talking him through the fear until help arrived. The story made the Ridgemont Gazette. This time, the headline read, "Local MC assists in teen rescue. Sheriff credits unlikely partnership." Monday morning, Marlowe found a note in her cubby at school. It was from Caitlin Stinson, written in careful cursive. "I'm sorry I was mean. You were right about them, and you were brave." It wasn't much, but it was something. That evening, Marlowe called Flint using the number he'd given her. Not because she was in trouble, just because she wanted to tell him about her week, about the assembly, about how things were changing. "Sounds like you started something, kid," Flint said. "I just told the truth," Marlowe replied. "That's usually how the best changes start." They talked for 20 minutes about small things, school, horses, the approaching winter. When they hung up, Marlowe felt something she'd almost forgotten, belonging, not to a place or a system, but to people who'd chosen her when they didn't have to. Outside, snow began to fall, the first of the season, transforming Ridgemont into something almost magical. And in that small Montana town, 312 elementary students went to bed, having learned that heroes don't always look like the movies promised, and that sometimes the most important promises are the ones nobody expects you to keep. Spring arrived in Ridgemont with wildflowers and transformation. 6 months had passed since the play. 6 months since 18 bikers had shown up and challenged everything the town believed about judgment and character. The changes weren't dramatic. Ridgemont hadn't suddenly become a bastion of open-mindedness, but they were real. Marlowe thrived. She made friends. She tried out for the spring musical and got a supporting role. She stopped flinching when adults made promises, started believing that some people actually meant what they said. Celeste began official adoption proceedings in March, and Marlowe would have a permanent home by summer. The bikers kept their promise too. Flint called every other week. Greer sent postcards from roads they travelled. Vesper showed up twice, once to help Celeste fix her barn roof, once to watch Marlowe's spring musical performance. They didn't make a big deal of it, they just showed up. In April, Ridgemont Elementary held its annual Community Service Awards. Principal Garrison stood before the assembled students and families, holding a plaque. This year's Community Hero Award goes to a group who taught us that character matters more than appearance, that promises kept matter more than reputation, and that family is defined by who shows up when showing up is hard. He smiled. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Flint and 3 others had driven up for the ceremony. They accepted the plaque with quiet dignity, Flint speaking briefly. "We just did what anyone should do. We kept our word to a kid who deserved someone to keep their word." The applause was genuine. No crossed arms, no suspicious glances, just respect, earned through consistency and grace. After the ceremony, as families mingled in the parking lot, Margaret Stinson approached. She'd lost weight, looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from confronting your own failings. "Mr. Flint," she said, her voice small, "I owe you an apology. I said terrible things about you. I tried to stop you from attending that play. I was wrong." Flint studied her for a moment. "You were scared. Fear makes people do questionable things." "That's generous," Margaret said, "more generous than I deserve." "Maybe," Flint agreed, "but grace isn't about what people deserve. It's about choosing kindness anyway." Margaret nodded, tears in her eyes, and walked away. As the sun set that evening, Marlowe sat on Celeste's porch, watching fireflies appear in the gathering dusk. Flint sat beside her, his massive frame making the porch swing creak. "You did good, kid," he said. "Changed a whole town's mind." "I didn't do anything," Marlowe protested. "You're the ones who came. Who showed up?" "We came because you asked. And you asked because you were brave enough to believe we would." Flint looked out at the Montana landscape, painted gold by sunset. "You know what the difference is between a promise and a lie? Follow through. We said we'd be there, so we were there. Simple as that." "Will you always come?" Marlowe asked quietly. "If I need you." "Always," Flint said. "That's what family does." And he meant it. Years would pass. Marlowe would graduate elementary school, then middle school, then high school. She'd face challenges and triumphs, heartbreaks and victories, and through it all, those bikers would be there. Not constantly, not intrusively, but consistently, showing up for graduations, for difficult moments, for the times when life knocked her down and she needed someone to believe she could get back up. When Marlowe turned 18 and aged out of foster care, legally becoming Celeste's adopted daughter, Flint and his crew rode up for the celebration. They'd become fixtures in Ridgemont by then, the motorcycle club that had taught a town about character. They never sought recognition, never made speeches about redemption or second chances. They just lived it, day after day, promise after promise, proving that honor doesn't need applause. It just needs consistency. And Marlowe, she grew into a woman who understood that family isn't about biology or legal paperwork. It's about who pulls you from burning wreckage, literal or metaphorical, and who keeps showing up long after the cameras stop rolling and the applause fades. She became a social worker, specializing in foster care. She told every child she worked with the same thing: family is who shows up, and someone will show up for you. I promise. And she always kept her promises, because she'd learned from the best. Thank you for listening to this story of promises kept and judgments challenged. If these northern confessions moved you, Please subscribe to our channel. We have many more stories about the quiet heroes who changed lives simply by keeping their word. Until next time, remember, family is who shows up when showing up is hard. Be that person for someone.